Hello and welcome to Tomorrow's Tech by IDTechEx. I'm your host, Dr. Tess Skyrme, and in this podcast series, I will be interviewing an array of industry experts on emerging technology from IDTechEx. IDTechEx is a market intelligence company with a mission to provide clarity on emerging technology. In each episode, our analysts will be discussing all kinds of topics, everything from virtual and augmented reality hardware, autonomous vehicles and flying cars, sustainability and energy storage innovations, medtech and wearables, 3D printing, advanced materials, and so much more. In each interview, we will explore what the future outlook is for each of these technologies, as well as endeavouring to find that elusive insight into hype versus reality. The topic of today's episode is batteries. Don't be fooled. Whilst the collection of AAAs in your kitchen drawer might make you class this topic as old-fashioned, as the digital age demands more and more power, the future of how we store our energy is an acutely important technical problem. The growth of investment and startup activity surrounding battery technology is amongst the fastest of today's emerging technology markets, and I'm privileged to have the opportunity to quiz one of IDTechEx's resident experts on this area, Research Director Alex Holland, on the episode today. Alex, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Tess. Always happy to talk battery development.
Yeah, thanks so much for being on the show. So perhaps if we start at the very beginning then with maybe a simple question, why is battery innovation kind of such a hot area in 2024?
Yeah, so various different macro trends going on, which highlight the importance of battery tech. I think one of the key ones to start with is, of course, kind of the electrification of transport, so electric cars, electric vehicles in general. The battery technology is really kind of what underpins all of that. Goes a long way to defining how high performing your electric vehicle is, how much range you get out of it, how quickly you can charge it, how long it will last, how much it will cost, so on and so forth. And of course, if we're worried about global warming and climate change, the transport sector is a huge contributor to carbon emissions, and electric vehicles are a really useful, good way, by no means a silver bullet, but there are a lot of savings to be had from a carbon perspective from moving away from internal combustion engines towards electric vehicles. And then related to that, you've got the adoption of increasing levels of renewable energy, so in particular solar power, wind power as well, various others as well. But as I'm sure you know, the listeners will know, these sources are often variable and intermittent. If the sun doesn't shine or the wind doesn't blow, then you still need a backup power source, electrical energy, power generation. And battery storage, lithium-ion battery storage in particular, has proven to be a very popular way over the last 5 years of basically maintaining that stable grid and ultimately meeting supply and demand variations as we've started to deploy more and more renewable energy sources.
Yeah, so I mean, sounds like batteries are going to save the world. So one question I have, just going to the vehicle electrification side,
Sure.
We hear a lot about the regulatory impact and the impact of, government policy on driving forward, the adoption of electric vehicles. But of course, as you mentioned, it also is really dependent on innovations in battery technology. How much is it the case that battery innovations have kind of really unlocked this market? And what is it about now that means batteries have got to the point where they can kind of deliver feasible electric vehicles? Why has it taken so long?
Sure.
Because as we mentioned at the beginning, batteries have been around for a long time.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, so I think it's important to maybe understand a little bit of the background to transport electrification, and regulatory pressures have ultimately underpinned a lot of demand for electric vehicles till now. And so the market has ultimately been underpinned by various governments around the world. But ultimately what we've got is also improvements in the electric vehicle itself. Obviously, specifically talking about the battery, we've had various different generations of a type of battery called the lithium-ion battery, which is, of course, very different from the AAAs that you mentioned in your
Yeah.
kitchen drawer earlier. Firstly, they're a lot more. They're rechargeable, so you can cycle them for an electric vehicle roughly 1,000 times. It is generally sufficient there or thereabouts. And as we've seen the market grow, ultimately underpinned by by government funding in one form or another, we've had various innovations to the battery technology. They've gotten more energy dense, they've gotten safer, you've been able to charge them faster. For certain types, you've been able to extend the cycle life. And very importantly as well, moving forward, is ultimately they've gotten cheaper. And part of that cost reduction hasn't just been about the scale of the market growing,
Yeah.
but specific innovations, developments to the battery that ultimately, for example, for various types of relatively popular battery chemistries, there's been a reduction in the amount of cobalt being used, which is, of course, expensive, and just general efficiencies in their design and in the manufacturing process has ultimately led to these cost reductions. And that's going to be really critical moving forward for the industry.
Yeah, so it's kind of compelling, but also it sounds a little like that's obviously the reduction in cost is really important. So that sounds to me a little like kind of, iterative gains and, the steps that companies have to make when they are so mature to kind of keep ahead of the game. But we also now have, if I understand correctly, lots of startups trying to get in the space
Sure.
or discussion of opportunities for brand new materials. So is that the case that we're about to see kind of a new era in battery innovation now, going beyond just making
Right.
everything cheaper?
So I wouldn't class it as a new era. I
Okay.
think when you look 10 years out, it probably will continue to look iterative
Right.
ultimately. But I think what we will see in certain segments of the battery market, so for premium electric vehicles, for example, for certain consumer electronics devices, you'll start to get some of these new battery designs coming
Okay.
forwards, starting to be used. They won't necessarily be used everywhere all at once,
Right.
but you'll start to get some of these more innovative, if I can say that, deviations from current battery designs. Up till now, if I can, take a step back, basically all lithium-ion batteries have been based on very similar designs. Effectively, it's formed of two electrodes, an anode and a cathode, with an electrolyte and separator ultimately in between. Those two electrodes ultimately storing your lithium. We're talking about kind of, I suppose, lithium-ion batteries in this case. And your electrolyte allowing that transport between them. And ultimately, at the anode, you've had graphite, various forms of graphite being used. And at the cathode, you've either had some form of metal oxide or some form of iron phosphate being used, with a liquid electrolyte in between. And ultimately, tweaks to these materials, tweaks to how they're put together, the designs, is generally speaking been all that's happened with battery design. But actually now we're starting to get to a point where we can move away from some of those tweaks to using some slightly different materials, some slightly different cell designs as well.
So what might consumers start to hear about as being these kind of exciting new
Sure.
novel materials that are going to end up in those high-end vehicles?
Sure. So I suppose there are a couple that spring to mind for me. The first is the solid state battery.
Okay.
This always gets a lot of press, a lot of interest, potentially even a little bit too much hype in the
Okay.
past. And ultimately, what you're doing with a solid state battery is you're replacing, as I mentioned, the liquid electrolyte before, you're replacing that with a solid. And by doing that, you're taking away what was ultimately a flammable material, potentially quite dangerous material, replacing it with
Right.
a safer, solid material. So making your battery a lot safer, and safety has been a key issue for the industry over the past few years. Related to that, the solid state battery, sometimes you will generally hear as well the potential for improving energy density. And what this means is you get longer run times from your devices, longer ranges from your electric vehicles, which is obviously a good thing. And what these solid electrolytes do is they enable you to start making use of higher energy anodes, so replacing the graphites that you were using with something like lithium metal directly, which has a much higher capacity to store lithium, because it is pure lithium. You're not storing it within the structure of the graphite. So this solid electrolyte can help enable the use of higher energy materials. So solid state batteries potentially enabling greater safety, higher energy density would be the first key kind of high level innovation. The second one that we're seeing is really the growing adoption of silicon anode materials.
Right.
So again, replacing the graphite with silicon, which has, again, a much higher capacity to store lithium than graphite. And here, some of the design changes to the cell can be slightly more easily incorporated. And so putting in this new silicon material, incorporating them into current manufacturing practices might be slightly easier. You can go through it in a slightly more stepwise manner, so incorporate more and more silicon material, replacing percentages of the graphite material. And again, the benefits are really that higher energy density, but with silicon, you also potentially get some pretty good performance benefits related to fast charge capability. So really charging your battery in a matter of 5-10 minutes, maybe even potentially some improvements to safety as well. And very long term, there may be some cost benefits from using silicon as opposed to graphite as well.
Okay. So on the first one, you mentioned the solid state. You
Sure.
said that you thought it was slightly overhyped, and then
Sure.
listed lots of reasons that sounded really sensible why it might be a good idea. So what are perhaps the areas that people are overlooking about the challenges?
I think just generally the industry was perhaps a little bit optimistic about how long it would take to incorporate these materials.
Right.
So manufacturing some of these solid electrolytes themselves, there are various different material systems on offer.
Okay.
Some of them can be quite difficult to manufacture or can be quite difficult to handle for safety, health and safety purposes.
Okay.
And then ultimately, incorporating a solid material into your cell instead of a liquid. This changes the manufacturing process that's been used for decades now, and
I see.
where we've had a huge amount of investment into optimization of those manufacturing processes. And some of the fundamentals of cell operation change as well. Of course, if you've got a liquid, your electrodes are ultimately these kind of porous composite structures. And getting good contact between your electrolyte and your electrodes can be relatively easy with a liquid. Whereas, of course, if you've got a solid, getting that good interfacial contact between those structures can be a bit more difficult. So various different factors, but ultimately things like manufacturing those changes in cell design ultimately being taking time to overcome.
Yeah. The other one there as well that you mentioned, the silicon anodes, and forgive me because I'm about to unveil how little I know about battery chemistry and design. But I hear as well about, people talking about different innovations and different material opportunities at the anode and at the cathode. And very naively to me, they're both electrodes. So why is it that you get these very specific innovations targeting one or the other?
Yeah, so I suppose ultimately we're limited by the fundamentals of the electrochemistry of your system, wanting a potential difference between your different electrodes, but also having to have these host structures that can enable ultimately lithium insertion and extraction. What I would say is at the anode, a lot of development really is focused on trying to improve performance, energy density, fast charge capability with silicon anodes, with lithium metal. At the cathode, you're slightly more limited with respect to how much performance you can eke out. There are routes forward, but we're talking a little bit more about incremental improvements in performance. But really, where a
Okay.
lot of the innovation with cathode material lies is in trying to optimize cell performance, trying to minimize ultimately the trade offs that are inherent in choosing one cathode material over another, as
Okay.
well as trying to take into consideration supply chain concerns,
Right.
trying to limit exposure to cobalt, for example, potentially even trying to limit the use of nickel, which is also relatively expensive. So those considerations become a lot more important at the cathode side.
I see. So one of the advantages I think I've picked up on some of this material innovation at the anode and the cathode is fast charging or faster charging opportunities. And that links really nicely into some questions I had just around kind of pain points with batteries in consumer electronics. Kind of had a moment to be introspective about, what do I find annoying about batteries
Right,
in,
of course,
in my everyday life.
of course.
And, yeah, it's not that different from EVs. My smartphone, I have to charge every day, as do I my smartwatch. It's kind of a bit heavy and a bit bulky. If
Yeah.
I'm going to work remotely with my laptop, I still want to be near a plug. So is battery innovation going to change any of that for me in the short term?
Yeah,
Or have we reached a bit of a limit of what we can expect?
I think optimistically, yes, you could expect
Okay.
some benefits. I think we've seen some innovation over the past couple of years. So I don't know if we should be naming names here, but we've got
Sure.
a relatively well-known silicon anode company deploying some of their material into kind of a relatively famous fitness wearable company.
Yeah.
Um, and they're obviously advertising longer run times as a key benefit.
Yeah.
And some of the improvements I talked about, especially with regards to silicon anodes and maybe even talking about lithium metal anodes, solid state batteries. As you mentioned, they could find their way into consumer devices, into other portable devices, household appliances, power tools,
Yeah.
those types of things. And as you mentioned, getting longer run times from your laptops, from your phones, from your watches will be pretty highly valued, especially if you're starting to increase, the functionality of some of these things. If you're starting to incorporate AI into your smartphones and there's greater power draw
Yeah.
ultimately,
Right.
then you're going to need greater battery capacity. And that's ultimately been a bit of a limiting factor, really, with the consumer devices industry. But
Yeah, I guess
also,
that's what I was going to say. Just to pick up on that, I
sure,
hadn't considered it quite in. You put that really clearly. So we're asking more and more of our devices all the time,
exactly.
while also wanting, even more from our batteries. So I'll let you go on to the next point you were going to make. But I just wondered the improvements we might expect to see. Very speculatively, what
Mhm.
scale could that
Right,
look like? Are we
right.
talking about I might not need to charge my phone for a week, or are we talking about a day and a half instead of a day? Kind of
Right. So
what might you think is reasonable?
if your smartphone today lasts one day, you might get to a point where you could eke out
Okay.
2 days out of it, and that's probably quite an optimistic view. That will
Yeah.
take time. That's gonna, that development's not going to come about next year. It's going to take many years for all
Yeah.
that to kind of feed through. But that's ultimately the scale of what we're looking at. If your state of the art today, for example,
Okay.
is something like sorry, so I'm going to use some technical kind
Go
of
for it.
characterization here. If your battery today in your smartphone is somewhere around kind of 600 watt hours per liter, so how much energy you store within a specific
Yeah.
volume, you might be able to get to 1,200 watt hours per liter. So
Right.
doubling the amount of capacity. But of course, if you're also doubling the amount of power draw and consumption, then you're sticking to a day, but with just greater functionality ultimately.
Okay. So that's really the crux of it. Then is physical size, I guess. I mean, the reason
Yes,
that we
yes,
can
exactly,
drive for hundreds of miles in electric vehicles is because they can host an enormous battery, whereas
exactly,
phones need to go in my pocket.
exactly.
Okay. Okay. So I guess, but having gone from the small, then if we could kind of go towards, batteries even bigger than those in cars. Like the other area that I see talked about a lot now is kind of the role of batteries within energy storage and, the theme of clean energy, more energy security. So how are batteries fitting into that picture at the moment?
Yes, so up till now, I suppose we've been talking about a specific type of battery, the lithium-ion battery, where you have ultimately lithium cations, positively charged lithium, moving between an anode and a cathode, and that's how you store energy. And actually, lithium-ion batteries have also played a big role in helping with the deployment of increasing levels of renewable power. Historically, we've been reliant on pumped hydro, effectively pumped hydro storage. So basically, just pumping water up a hill and then dropping it down through a turbine.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring that up. That was one of my questions because when I was thinking about what is, the current incumbent large scale energy storage, my
Sure.
first thought, is big dams of water. And I
Yeah,
just wondered if that
exactly.
was anywhere near right or
Exactly.
if there was something else. Okay.
Yeah, so I mean, ultimately the crux of the problem is being able to deploy electricity at periods when you need it,
Hmm.
so that consumers, have that electricity. And obviously, if you have a little bit of a shortfall, you can release some of that water from a dam or
Yeah.
discharge a battery.
Right.
And then when you've got some excess generation, for example, from a wind turbine in the middle of the night or solar power in the middle of the day, if it's not being used, pump that water back up. But ultimately, moving forward, the additional capacity you're going to get from pumped hydro is probably going to be a bit limited. There are new sites
Right.
being explored, but it is obviously geographically somewhat limited.
Hmm.
And so there's a lot of interest in battery technologies. And at the moment, lithium ion, because it's widely available, because it's well understood, even relatively cheap, has come to the front of the market and being very successful. But there is a lot of space actually for innovation in this area for alternative battery chemistries and
Hmm.
even alternative storage technologies to play a lot more of an important role. Whereas with electric vehicles, with consumer devices, because you're so focused on energy density, because energy density is such an important performance characteristics, you're kind of limited to various different lithium-ion chemistries, with some caveats there and some exceptions, of course. But
Yeah.
within this larger scale, grid scale space, in terms of renewable power integration, you've got a lot more options on the table.
Yeah. And so what are some of those other options? I've heard of this redox flow battery
Yeah,
for an example. Is that the most important kind of innovation in the space, or is it just one of many?
I think it's really kind of one of many. So you've got
Okay.
any kind of technology that allows a reduction in cost below the price point, or will allow a future reduction in cost below the price point of lithium ion, really being of interest. So you brought up redox flow batteries
Mm.
there. The important part of that, I think, is really kind of the flow battery part. So really within a lithium-ion battery, it's contained within one cell. Ultimately, if you take your phone apart, you can see the battery. It's all contained there. Within a flow battery, you've separated the power generation and the energy storage generation components. So
Right.
your energy capacity is effectively just stored in a large tank. And what this means is if you need to store large amounts of energy, as opposed to needing to charge or discharge quickly to generate large amounts of power, you can scale those storage tanks relatively easily and, in theory, therefore relatively cheaply. So you get that energy capacity, storage capacity at a lower price point. But
Right.
there are various different technologies, ultimately trying be based around low cost materials. So zinc, for example, iron,
Okay.
any other kind of low cost material, or even moving away from batteries altogether towards other alternatives.
I see. Am I right in understanding that IDTechEx does forecast that kind of, the market for batteries within stationary energy storage is going to grow quite fast now in the next 10 years? This is
Yes.
kind of quite a near term, disruption.
Yeah, so I suppose just to provide a little bit of color on that, yeah,
Yeah.
we I suppose we started on electric vehicles, consumer
Right.
devices, and for a relatively good reason. Lithium-ion batteries were first commercialized for camcorders, and then the market grew relatively quickly because of the advent of things like smartphones and laptops and
Yeah.
even tablets and stuff like that. And then a few years later, around the 2010s or so, you had the advent of kind of electric vehicles, your Nissan Leafs, your Teslas of the world, and really kind of for the battery market, electric vehicles are the largest addressable market. So that's where there's a lot of focus centered on the
Yeah.
automotive market. But actually moving forward, the stationary market is probably going to grow at a faster rate, in part because it's growing from a lower base, but also because of
Right.
the fundamental importance of an expectation that we're going to see deployment of more and more renewable power. Those penetration levels are going to increase. And as your power grids, your electricity grids make use of more renewable power, the importance of energy storage becomes greater as well. And so that's where ultimately that demand comes from.
Yeah.
So we do actually see very rapid growth in the stationary storage sector for grid scale batteries, residential batteries, so on and so forth.
Yeah. I noticed that the prediction for the Australian market was something like twice as fast as the US and Europe. Is there a particular reason for that kind of distinct geographical disparity?
I suppose for the stationary storage sector in particular, it is very kind of regionally dependent. As I mentioned, because it depends on the level of renewable deployment, for example. If you haven't deployed many renewables, there's less demand for stationary storage. But it also depends on things like how old your grid, your power grid is, how capable it is of incorporating new power sources. And in Australia, there's been a big push for solar power, but also for things like residential batteries, of course, potentially probably coupled with solar power because it's such a abundant resource in that region. But you've also got other factors kind of coming into play if there are concerns about blackouts or natural disasters or wildfires and needing to have a more reliable grid and ultimately having some capability to be self-sufficient. And these are all going to be really important factors for the stationary storage market. So you do see areas like Australia, like California, for example, certain regions in Europe, Germany, being slightly, being ahead with regards to their deployments or expected deployments for stationary storage. And just to mention as Gwen, as with the EV market and the important role legislation ultimately played, incentives ultimately played in helping underpin demand for electric vehicles, and during those early years, the same goes for stationary storage, whether there are those incentives in place or whether even the market structure allows for storage to really be deployed.
Yeah. So it's just very tightly coupled to the renewables market then, by the sounds, because that's where they're ultimately playing a role
it's
downstream.
certainly a key part.
Okay. I guess just related slightly then to the theme of sustainability, with electrification often being hailed as the cleaner alternative to our other energy sources. I'm assuming that there are some fairly dirty places in the battery supply chain, and concerns about sustainability and innovations along the value chain as well. So is there anything there in particular that people should be aware of where there's scope for improvement or kind of gaps in the market for innovations to making batteries better?
Yeah, of course. I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, we've talked about electric vehicles, we've talked about renewable deployments. So these, the deployment and the development of battery technology is really kind of environmentally driven. So you absolutely want that supply chain to be as transparent as possible and ultimately as clean as possible. Historically, there's of course been a lot of discussion around the role of cobalt, a lot of which is mined in the Congo, and there are some mining practices there which are, let's say, less than ideal.
Sure.
There are other, environmental concerns around the mining of lithium, the use of water resources, about the dumping of waste, nickel mining, so on and so forth. But ultimately, consuming anything, producing anything is going to have an impact. And the battery industry as a whole is very much aware that this is an issue.
Right.
And so there are efforts being made to make sure that there is transparency in the supply chain, that there's also going to be accounting effectively. So, for example, in Europe, battery manufacturers are going to be required to put carbon footprint labeling onto their batteries. And batteries, ultimately in the short term, this will just be kind of a labeling requirement, a reporting requirement, but longer term, there may be impacts as to whether there are going to be ultimately some form of penalty if you don't meet certain requirements. Companies worldwide are obviously trying to get their supply chains in order, making sure that they've got access to the right materials from the right suppliers with the right kind of environmental, social governance ultimately. And so there is, within the industry, a lot of effort to make sure that, yes, those environmental concerns are being looked at, and ultimately, the key factor is that battery technology, electric vehicles, large scale grid storage batteries, they're going to help to enable reductions in carbon dioxide emissions from those industries.
Yeah, makes sense. I get the sense, though, from what we've talked about, that despite the issues and despite the environmental regulation pressure, that it's not anticipated that those pressures are going to result in a big shift away from kind of the lithium norm anytime soon. Is that kind of roughly
No, I
correct?
think ultimately the lithium-ion battery is the best placed technology to help enable those industries we've talked about, and we will probably see some shake-up of the industry, especially in kind of the US or Europe, due to some of those maybe environmental concerns, supply chain concerns. But ultimately, the lithium-ion battery is best placed to help electrify certainly the transport industry, and in the short term, very well placed to continue to help enabling the deployment of renewable energies.
Okay. So in contrast then, if you had to think or pick out an innovation that you have seen or a company that you have spoken to, the technology theme that they're developing, what innovations do you think are going to be the most disruptive in the next kind of 5 to 10 years?
Yes, I think I'll have to come back to. We have obviously a whole team of analysts at IDTechEx, and we all have slightly different opinions, and then we obviously discuss these regularly. But for me, we're relatively optimistic and positive on the outlook of the role that silicon anodes can play in improving vehicle range, in improving device runtime, in enabling fast charge capability. So we think, when we speak to different players in the space, when we attend conferences, automotive OEMs, battery manufacturers, they're starting to look at, how quickly you can charge a battery as being quite a key differentiator and key kind of future performance metric. And silicon anodes, the kind of the next generation of silicon material that is being kind of developed and at the very early stages of commercialization now, they can enable some of those performance improvements moving forward, and ultimately enabling those improvements to electric vehicle range, fast charge performance, safety, so on and so forth, is going to be key for the industry and therefore key for kind of environmental benefits.
Yeah, I mean, so if it provides you any comfort, that does mean that you tally pretty much with what Shazan, who is our EV charging expert, kind of spoke about a couple of weeks ago, and was talking about how in the EV space anyway, there's a perceived shift away from range anxiety towards charge anxiety, which I always manage to find an anecdote related to my mum in these discussions, and having been driven around by her in her electric vehicle this weekend, I have experienced charge anxiety firsthand. So I can well believe that this is a pain point in the market. So then perhaps finally then, and we've touched on a few of these a little bit throughout, but are there any areas as well that you think are particularly overhyped in batteries at the moment? And that can be, within the lithium ion area we've mentioned, or, in the broader space, anything that you think is, kind of a bit of a red flag.
So I don't necessarily want to pick out a specific kind of area, but I suppose
Yeah, okay.
whenever you look at the next big thing, the next holy grail new chemistry
Yeah,
that's going to enable, a 1,000-mile driving car,
right.
low cost renewable storage system, I think you just have to take it with a bit of caution. Why
Hmm.
hasn't it already been deployed? What are the
Yeah,
concerns with the technology? There are probably some disadvantages. It, of course, as always, needs to be proven at scale, needs to be manufactured at scale, needs to be deployed in a real life system. And so all these kind of questions, I think, are things which we have to consider, and ultimately, ask the question: why hasn't it been done already? What's the key thing that means? Kind of now is the time for this technology. And I think just on the whole, with respect to kind of the battery industry, I think there have been maybe some past concerns about overhype, and maybe some
yeah,
examples of performance being kind of overhyped, or maybe some slightly optimistic timelines. And I think
right.
on the whole, from my experience at least, coming from a PhD in the space through to my time at IDTechEx, there's a little bit more caution here with
Okay.
respect to talking about next gen technologies, a little bit more
Yeah,
realism and understanding that actually generating this kind of overhyped story perhaps isn't a good thing on the whole for the
right.
industry, and there's a need to be relatively cogent about it.
Okay, so I'm going to summarize that as it sounds like the market is slightly cautious, but the opportunity for startups is there and is big if you
Absolutely.
crack it,
Oh,
but the bar is
absolutely.
just really high.
Yeah, and you're especially
Um,
against lithium ion, you're competing
yeah,
against a moving target. They're going to
right.
keep improving, and there are absolutely opportunities there, and the size of the market alone kind of suggests that. But there are still pain points in technology, which means someone could come in and kind of offer something valuable. But yeah, it's certainly a tricky space to operate in.
Yeah. Oh, well, thank you so much for your time. I've learned an enormous amount, and I know the people listening will as well. Perhaps just a final question was, I know that you put out, a lot of research on this area. So
Sure.
what are you looking at next in terms of coverage? What area within the battery space is next on the list to analyze?
Right. So we're just wrapping up some of our research into next gen kind of
Okay.
technologies. Actually, basically just trying to, we're obviously trying to track everything that's going on because there are so many different technologies under development. We've been looking at things like silicon anodes, solid state batteries, lithium metal, but also the various different kind of cathode technologies that are under development, the suite of materials there. So looking at high manganese cathodes, for example, are
Oh, wow.
particularly interesting areas. Here you're kind of removing things like nickel and cobalt. So lots of things to track. We've got a great team in place looking at all the various different battery technologies being developed for renewable storage, for example, looking at things like iron air batteries or zinc air batteries. So again, I don't want to point at any one particular thing because there's so much going on, and it would be a disservice
Yeah.
to kind of to point out one specific area.
Okay. But
Sorry, a bit
plenty
of a
more to get into
wishy-washy,
then. No.
answer to end on.
Yeah, well, like, no, well, I guess the takeaway is for people who may not know much about batteries is that this is actually a really, really rich innovation space with
Exactly.
a huge amount of different trends. So,
And
yeah,
there's not going to be
it
one
really isn't about
single
those.
winner, right? There's going to
Yeah,
be space for
right.
various different technologies and developments to play a
Okay.
role.
Okay. So batteries are more exciting than people might think. That's what
I think so.
that's what I'm
Yes.
going to end with. Okay, great. Thank you so much, Alex. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Tess.
Thank you so much for listening to Tomorrow's Tech, hosted by IDTechEx. IDTechEx offers independent market intelligence on emerging technologies. For more detailed information on this topic and many others, please go to idtechex.com, where there are dedicated research reports on the emerging technologies we cover, as well as articles and free to attend webinars.